Thanks for tuning in to Operation Revenge. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin the story.
I hadn't been back here in years, too many years to count. But when Nolan called, there was no one else. And after reading that email, I wasn't going to back out. Not for him, but for the kids. I stepped into the house and immediately felt the weight of the disarray. Trina stood by the door, arms crossed, a wine bottle shoved in my hands. She barely looked at me, the sharpness in her eyes all too familiar. "You're early," she said, flat as a pancake. "Kids okay?" I asked, already hearing the chaos coming from the next room. She rolled her eyes. "They're fine. You know, maybe a little too structured for their taste. We've been managing." The house? It was a mess. Furniture upturned, papers scattered, toys piled high like they were trying to escape. It was like a war zone, not the kind of thing you'd expect from two parents. I didn't waste time. I walked into the living room where the twins were wrestling on the floor, knocking over a lamp. Neither of them seemed to notice my entrance. "Ethan! Eli!" I barked. "Stand at attention, now." For a second, they didn't move. Then, like soldiers snapped out of a daze, they scrambled up and froze, their eyes wide, unsure whether to be scared or impressed. I folded my arms. "I'm Captain Auntie. You will call me Captain." "Got it?" Ethan hesitated. Eli saluted me, and then Ethan followed. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't play acting. They did it with a kind of relief, as if they had been waiting for someone to give them the order. Trina shot me a look, but she didn't say anything. "You break something," I continued. "You fix it." "Go." They moved without a word, starting to pick up the toys, straightening out the mess. In minutes, the chaos turned to order. Trina glanced at Nolan, who stood silent in the doorway, watching. She didn't speak, but the tension in her shoulders told me everything I needed to know. She didn't like it, didn't like me. But the boys? They were listening, they were responding, and that was enough for me. The doorbell rang just as I was finishing my second glass of wine. Nolan's email had been blunt. "Can you take them? No one else will." No question, no apologies, just a line tossed in my lap. And I agreed, not because of him, but because those kids needed someone who wasn't just going to let them run wild. I grabbed my bag, took a deep breath, and stepped out the door. When I pulled up to the house, it was a quiet kind of mess, the kind that seeps into the corners of your bones. Trina answered the door almost before I had a chance to knock, holding a bottle of wine like it was some kind of peace offering. "Thanks," she said, without much enthusiasm, taking a step back. "We don't have much of a schedule, but you know where the guest room is." She didn't even offer to take my bag. Inside, the house felt like a warehouse for lost toys and scattered memories. The twins were running through the hall, laughing and shouting at each other. They didn't even look up when I walked in. Their noise was relentless, a buzz that made my head throb. I took a breath and called out, "Ethan, Eli, report to me now." They froze mid-game, still holding their toy guns, eyes wide but unfocused. It took them a second to register, then both slowly moved toward me, as if unsure whether to keep playing or to listen. I raised an eyebrow. "Now." They shuffled over, and for a moment, I almost didn't know what to do with myself. My voice came out firm, without any of the hesitation I'd once felt trying to connect with them. "Listen up," I said, looking at both of them. "I'm not from the firefighter place. I'm the captain now. You answer to me. Got it?" They exchanged a glance. Then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, they snapped into salute. "Captain Auntie," Eli said with a grin, his eyes wide and full of something close to relief. Ethan nodded. "Yes, Captain." I stood there for a moment, waiting, then said, "Good. Now you two. No more fighting, no more breaking things. We have a system here." Trina didn't say a word, just watched us from across the room. Her arms were still crossed, but her eyes were heavy with something. Resentment, maybe, or disbelief. I wasn't sure. Nolan was nowhere in sight. That night, after a chaotic dinner with more questions about what I was doing there than I cared to count, the twins refused to go to bed. They kept popping their heads out of their room, making excuses. "We're not tired," Ethan whined. "Tell us a rescue story, Captain." I leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching them squirm in their beds. "A rescue story?" I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "Yeah, from the firefighter place," Eli shouted, kicking his covers off. I shook my head, crossing the room to sit at the edge of their beds. "No firefighter stories, but I'll tell you about the time we saved a cat from a tree. It wasn't a big deal, but it was my first solo. Their eyes lit up, and for the first time that day, the noise in the house quieted. I spoke slowly, keeping it simple, laying out the details of the rescue, how we had to plan, how we had to trust each other, how it wasn't just about saving the cat, but getting everyone home safe. By the end of it, they were hanging on every word, their wide eyes fixed on me as if I were the only thing that mattered in that moment. "Captain," Eli whispered, "are you going to save us too?" I looked down at him, feeling something stir in me that I didn't expect. "I'll always be there to keep you safe, Eli. Always." They fell asleep shortly after, still murmuring between each other, half in dreams. Trina stayed silent in the hallway, leaning against the wall, watching me from the shadows. She didn't speak. Nolan still hadn't come down. I left the door cracked open and let the quiet take over the house. The only sounds now the steady breathing of the twins. They were already starting to trust me. It felt like a win, but also like a warning. Because if I was going to do this, I wasn't just here to babysit. I was here to give them something their parents never could. Something real. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. It wasn't the twins that got me up. It was the weight of the responsibility hanging over me. I needed to ground myself, so I did what I'd always done when things felt off. I put on my uniform. Not for show, not to impress anyone, but because it made me feel like I could breathe. The crisp lines of the shirt, the familiar weight of the boots, the comfort of the jacket, these things weren't just gear. They were my foundation. I walked down to the kitchen in full uniform, the fabric rustling quietly. Trina was already there, leaning against the counter, a cup of coffee in hand. When she saw me, her lips curled into a half-amused, half-sarcastic smile. "Really?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "And stay. You think the kids need a drill sergeant?" I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. She knew I wasn't here to put on a show. I was here to make a point, to give them something stable, something they could rely on. "Kids need structure," I said, my voice steady, no edge. "They need consistency. They need someone who's not going to back down." She snorted and took another sip of her coffee. "Sure, let me know how that works out for you." I ignored her, instead looking around the kitchen. It wasn't just the living room I'd seen last night. The house as a whole felt like a disaster zone. Dishes piled in the sink, clothes and toys scattered everywhere. The kitchen table was half buried under unopened mail and random papers. The chaos wasn't just physical, it was embedded in the air, in the way everyone moved through the house like nothing mattered. The twins were already at the table, eating cereal that looked like it had been sitting there too long. I didn't say anything at first. I just moved into the space, straightening things, cleaning up a little, setting a quiet tone. "Ethan, Eli," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Mission time. You're in charge of cleaning up this kitchen. And you're not just going to throw things around. You're going to work as a team. Got it?" They exchanged glances, unsure at first. I didn't expect them to jump to it immediately, but they stood up and started picking up the dishes. Ethan took a mug to the sink. Eli grabbed a napkin to wipe down the table. Slowly, they began moving more purposefully. Trina watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. I could feel her eyes on me, but I didn't let it throw me off. After a few minutes, I set a new task. "Mission 2, I said. "Today's contest. Who can eat their veggies first and pick the story for tonight? You've got 10 minutes to finish your plates. Ready?" The twins groaned, but they didn't protest. Instead, they dug in. They weren't thrilled, but they knew the deal. A few minutes later, Ethan was pushing his plate toward me with a dramatic sigh. "Captain, I'm done," he said, half smiling. Eli, still chewing slowly, gave him a look. "Not fair. I need more time." But he kept eating. Trina didn't say anything, but I could feel her eyes on me. She'd probably seen all this before, tried to control the chaos her own way. Her method was to let them do whatever they wanted, let them keep the noise level at a constant decibel of disaster. Mine was different. I didn't have to yell to get results. At dinner that night, the twins were quieter. They were still rambunctious, but the structure had set a tone. They asked for stories, rescue stories, of course, and I told them about the time we saved a dog from a collapsed building. They were captivated, hanging on every word, eyes wide with excitement. It wasn't about the stories themselves. It was about something else. Trust, maybe. They were trusting me to keep them safe, to give them something they could count on. Trina just sat there, silent, picking at her food. I could feel her judgment seeping out, but I didn't respond. Let the results speak for themselves. When dinner was over, I gave them a new mission: bath time. They didn't complain. They didn't argue. They went, and they followed through. By the time I was tucking them in, there was no fighting, no running around, just quiet, calm, the way it should have been all along. As I stood in the doorway, I gave them one last order. Sleep tight, soldiers. Tomorrow's another day. Rest up. Ethan saluted, then Eli followed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe I was doing something right. Maybe the structure they needed was more than just routines. Maybe it was something deeper, something real. Trina still hadn't said a word, but her eyes followed me. She'd seen the change in them, seen how the house was quieter, how the twins were a little more grounded. I didn't need her approval, but I was starting to wonder if she might be wondering if I was onto something after all. The next morning, I found the twins in full chaos mode again. Ethan was jumping off the couch like it was a trampoline, and Eli was up on top of the bookshelf, trying to balance a toy truck on his head. The room was trashed, books strewn on the floor, clothes flung across the room, and the TV blasting cartoons at full volume. They didn't even hear me enter. I stood there for a few seconds, arms crossed, just watching. It was a mess, and not just the room. Their energy was all over the place, unfocused, wild, but I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to play their game. I cleared my throat, and when they didn't stop, I said calmly, "Ethan, Eli, fall in line." The boys froze. Their heads snapped around, eyes wide. They stood at attention, no hesitation, no joke this time. "Captain?" Eli asked, his voice tentative but hopeful. "Mission time," I said, taking a step forward. "This room doesn't clean itself. Get to work. It's a two-man job. Start by picking up the books. Eli, you're on close. Got it?" They both saluted, a bit slower this time, but with a quiet, almost relieved determination. "Got it, Captain," Ethan said, his grin barely hiding the excitement. He grabbed a stack of books and started organizing them. Eli jumped down from the shelf and grabbed a pile of clothes. Neither one of them complained. They didn't argue. It was like someone had flicked a switch, and suddenly they were back in line. I glanced over my shoulder to see Trina standing in the doorway, arms crossed. Her face was unreadable, but I could see the annoyance in the tightness of her jaw. She hadn't even bothered to say anything yet, but she wasn't happy. She never was when things didn't go according to her plan. Nolan appeared behind her, looking awkward, like he wasn't sure if he should get involved. He said nothing, but his eyes were fixed on me. "Don't just stand there," I said without turning. "This isn't a free-for-all. We all help." I gave them a mission to clean the living room as well. It took less than 10 minutes. The twins didn't dawdle. They worked together, finished their task, and stood there waiting for the next assignment. Trina rolled her eyes from the doorframe. "Is this what you call parenting? Military camp?" I didn't flinch. I didn't look her way. "Without structure, there's no parenting," I said calmly. "No rules, no guidance. It's just chaos." "Right," she muttered, barely containing her sarcasm. "Guess the kids are better off with a captain than actual parents, huh?" I didn't rise to the bait. I just gave the boys a nod. "Mission complete. You two did great. Now, time to gear up for the next round." Ethan and Eli grinned at me, then saluted again. I almost expected a salute back from Trina. Almost. Nolan shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. He wasn't engaging in the back and forth between me and Trina. He just watched. I could see the gears turning in his head, though. He was caught between two worlds. "This is ridiculous," Trina muttered, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You don't have to turn everything into a military operation. They're just kids." "They're my kids, Trina," Nolan said quietly, almost to himself. "They need something, and they're not getting it from us." The words hung in the air, heavy, like the unspoken truths neither of them wanted to face. Nolan didn't look at me when he spoke, but I knew he wasn't disagreeing. He was just lost. He didn't know how to handle this, and I wasn't sure he ever had. I turned back to the twins. "Mission complete. Well done. Now, what's next?" "Story!" they both shouted, like they couldn't contain themselves. I smiled, but just barely. The atmosphere had thickened with tension. Trina was watching us like a hawk, and Nolan was caught between her and me, not knowing which side he should be on. But I didn't care about Trina's opinion, not anymore. She could mock me all she wanted. It wouldn't change the fact that the twins were listening. It wouldn't change the fact that they were thriving under a bit of structure. They needed this. They needed me. And that was the truth neither Trina nor Nolan could deny forever. Nolan cleared his throat, his voice a little hesitant. Maybe a story isn't a bad idea. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall. I didn't respond, just turned to the boys. All right, you two, I said. The next mission involves some very important lessons, involving your dinner choices, but first, let's settle in for a story. And this one's a big one. They sat down eagerly. They didn't need any more orders. They were ready to listen. And that was progress. The days blurred together in a strange rhythm. The twins were calmer, at least around me. It wasn't perfect, but the chaos had a sense of direction now. They followed the missions. They saluted. They obeyed. But underneath that structure, I started noticing things, little things that gnawed at me when I had a moment to breathe. It started one night after they'd been asleep for an hour. I was reading a book in the living room when I heard a soft sound, like a quiet sob. At first, I figured it was just the usual nighttime noises, but then it came again. I stood up and walked down the hall, the faint light from the nightlight casting shadows on the walls. I found Ethan sitting up in bed, clutching the blankets around him. His eyes were wide, his face streaked with tears. I knelt down beside him. Ethan, hey, what's wrong? He sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. Shadows! They move. I glanced around, but the room was still, just the soft glow of the nightlight and the streetlight outside. Shadows can be scary, yeah, I said quietly, but they're not going to hurt you. You're safe. He nodded, but I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe it. Want me to stay for a bit? I asked. He didn't answer, just crawled toward me, curling up in the blankets. I stayed with him, watching as his breathing slowed and his body relaxed. Eventually, he fell asleep, but not without a few more shaky breaths. The next night, it happened again. And the next. Same fear, same quiet sobs. It was always about the shadows. Then there was Eli. I'd noticed him ducking into the closet during the evenings. The first time I saw it, I thought maybe he was just playing a game. But when I saw him do it again, when I asked him what he was doing, he just looked up at me, his eyes wide and cautious. I don't like it when they yell, he said, his voice small, barely above a whisper. When they fight. It was so quiet that night, too. Just Trina and Nolan in the other room. But it didn't matter. The tension was there, thick and suffocating, even if there were no raised voices. Eli had learned to retreat, to hide, to become invisible when things felt unstable. At least the kids still had each other. I saw them more and more leaning on each other, side by side in that small, shared world they had created. They played their games, but they weren't just kids' games. No, they were building something else, something that felt bigger than pretend. I walked in on them one afternoon and found them at the kitchen table. They were playing a game with their toys, but it wasn't about saving the world or building empires. It was a mock trial. Eli was sitting at the judge's seat, and Ethan was the defendant. The dolls and action figures were the witnesses. The courtroom was chaotic, the room filled with little voices arguing for their sides. Guilty! Eli shouted, banging a toy hammer on the table. Ethan, the accused, didn't even protest. He just nodded, face blank, and went back to stacking the toys. Guilty, he repeated under his breath. We're all guilty. I stood in the doorway, not sure what to do. The game wasn't just a game. It was a reflection of everything they'd been through. They didn't know how to play a normal game. They didn't know how to feel safe. It was all about blame, about judgment, about things beyond their control. That evening, I found something else, a crumpled drawing in the corner of the living room. I unfolded it slowly, a pit in my stomach as I saw what it was. 2 stick figures holding hands, with a big question in the middle. Can you be our real family? I stared at it for a long time, feeling my chest tighten. I hadn't signed up for this. I hadn't come here to fix their brokenness. I was just trying to give them a few days of peace. But somehow, it wasn't just about babysitting anymore. They needed more than structure. They needed something I hadn't expected to give, something I didn't know how to give. I didn't even know if I was enough. But I had to try. The twins had settled into a new routine. They laughed more than they had before, ate better, and even managed to sleep without the nightmares that used to haunt them. For the first time, I saw them as kids, not just casualties of a broken home, but little people with their own hopes, their own fears. They needed stability. They needed someone to anchor them. And somehow, that someone had to be me. Trina and Nolan? They remained disengaged. Trina still made snide comments, always pulling away, always too distant to reach. Nolan said less and less. He was caught somewhere between my method and Trina's apathy, unsure how to respond to either, but I could see it in his eyes now. There was a crack in his certainty. He wasn't sure what was going on anymore. He wasn't sure if I was the problem or the solution, but I knew one thing. If I didn't keep anchoring this ship, they'd sink. They needed me. And somehow, I was starting to realize that I needed them too. I was putting away dishes when I noticed the tablet on the kitchen counter. It wasn't unusual for it to be lying there, but this time it was open. A few lines of text were visible, something about custody and concerns. I felt a cold prickling in my gut, and against my better judgment, I reached for it. Trina was nowhere in sight, probably holed up in her room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't know what I expected to find, but what I saw made my stomach churn. The email was to a lawyer, and in it, Trina laid out her plans. I need to block her from having any influence on the boys. She's cold, detached, not maternal. She's not even a real part of their lives. I won't let her take them away from me. I let the tablet fall back onto the counter with a quiet thud. My pulse was thumping in my ears. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't even considered it. But now it was undeniable. Trina was already planning her moves. She didn't just want me gone. She wanted to shut me out of their lives altogether. And the boys? She was using them as leverage. I didn't let myself react. Not yet. I turned my back to the kitchen and looked out the window, the weight of her words pressing into my chest. I had come here to help, to make things better. But apparently, that wasn't enough. For a long moment, I just stood there, trying to breathe through the tightness in my lungs. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen this. I couldn't let her control the narrative. Couldn't let her take this out of my hands. The next day, I called a family lawyer. I didn't know what I was hoping for, maybe some advice, maybe an answer, but I needed something. I couldn't just sit back and watch them fall apart. The office was clean and clinical, just like every other law firm I'd been to. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman with sharp glasses, listened quietly as I laid out what I'd seen. When I was done, she leaned back in her chair and took a slow breath. "Filing a concern affidavit is a good first step," she said, tapping her pen on the desk. "But I'll warn you, it's going to get messy. Family law doesn't like to move quickly. It's emotional, unpredictable, and it's not just about you and your brother anymore. You'll be pulling the kids into something bigger than they can handle." I knew what she was saying. I had seen it before. Families torn apart, dragged through legal battles until no one remembered what they were fighting for in the first place. But I wasn't leaving the twins behind. I wasn't going to stand by and let Trina tear apart whatever stability I'd managed to give them. "I'm not here to fight for custody," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. "I just want my concerns on record. If they're not safe, someone has to step in." The lawyer nodded slowly. "You're right. The kids are the priority, but be prepared. When you file, it's not just about your concerns. It'll open up everything, their home life, their emotional state, all of it. And you could be putting yourself in a position where you'll be under a microscope." "I'm fine with that," I said, my words coming out a little more firmly than I intended. "I'm done retreating. They need more than what they're getting now. I can't just walk away from them." She looked at me for a long moment, studying me like she was trying to figure out if I understood the weight of what I was saying. Finally, she nodded again. "All right, I'll file the affidavit. We'll start with that. But you need to be prepared for the fallout. It's going to be harder than you think." I didn't flinch. "I'm ready." I left the office feeling heavier than when I'd walked in. But I wasn't uncertain. I wasn't backing down. Trina could try to shut me out. She could call me cold and detached. But I knew one thing for sure. The twins weren't going to fall through the cracks on my watch. And if I had to fight for them, I would. Over the next few days, I moved like a ghost through the house, documenting everything I could. I didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to give Trina any reason to think I was out to get her. But I knew this was bigger than just showing up and playing Captain Auntie. The twins were slipping through the cracks, and if I didn't act now, they might disappear in a system that was already too broken to care. I started with the arguments. The yelling was quieter than before, but still there. Sharp words exchanged in the middle of the night, things I couldn't unhear. When Trina and Nolan thought the twins were asleep, they'd tear into each other about everything. Money, control, whose fault it was that the kids were acting out. I started recording them when I could, not with a camera in hand, but with my phone tucked away in my pocket, the recorder running. I didn't need to catch every word, but I needed evidence that the tension wasn't just in my head. And when I caught Nolan saying something like, "They're too much for you, Trina. You don't know how to deal with them," I knew I had something. The boys were retreating more. Ethan was more withdrawn, often found alone in the corner of the living room, staring at his phone without really engaging with anything. Eli, on the other hand, was quieter than usual. I started noticing the little things, the way they flinched when they heard loud noises, the way they would flinch when Trina and Nolan fought, even if it wasn't directed at them. I spoke to the school teacher one afternoon. She had been noticing it too, she said. Ethan was distracted, unfocused in class, often staring out the window instead of participating. Eli was much worse, more withdrawn, always drawing in the back of the classroom, never really connecting with the other kids. "Something's off, but they're not saying anything," Mrs. Daniels told me, looking down at her desk as if she'd been holding back. "They're not the same kids anymore. They're quieter, more reserved. It's like they're not sure where they belong." She agreed to give me a written statement for my file. She described their emotional and behavioral patterns, how they had both started out as energetic, involved students, and now seemed to be barely holding on. One night, after the boys had gone to bed, I found something under my bedroom door. It was a drawing, folded neatly and left right on the edge of the carpet. I sat down to unfold it, my heart sinking as I saw the words, "Captain Auntie keeps us safe." It was simple, just two stick figures holding hands, one labeled Captain Auntie, the other Ethan, and Eli drawn next to each other. They were smiling, and for a moment, I let myself think that maybe, just maybe, I was making a difference. But then I remembered why I was doing this. I wasn't here to be their hero. I was here because their parents weren't enough, and they needed someone who would actually fight for them. The next day, I gathered everything I'd collected, the recordings, the notes from the teacher, the drawings, and compiled it all in a folder. I called the lawyer again. She said she'd start the paperwork for supervised visitation, but that it would take time, a lot of time. The system wasn't built for urgency, and if I wanted temporary guardianship, I'd have to convince the court that I could provide more than just structure. I had to prove I could give them something real. "You have a lot on your side," she told me over the phone, "but there's a lot against you too. You're single, you're mobile, and you don't have a permanent home. The court might question your ability to give them stability." I stared at the phone for a moment, letting her words sink in. "I'm not leaving them behind," I said quietly. "I'm not walking away from this. Whatever it takes." She sighed on the other end of the line. "It's going to get messy. Be ready for it." "I'm ready," I said, and I meant it. I had to be. I wasn't here just for the fight. I was here for the kids. I couldn't back down now. The truth was staring me in the face. The longer I waited, the more they would fall apart, and if I wasn't the one to anchor them, no one else would be. The courtroom was cold, the kind of sterile space that made everything feel like it was happening to someone else. I sat at the table with my lawyer, hands clenched together, trying to keep my thoughts from spinning out of control. My heart was a steady drumbeat in my chest, but I was determined not to let it show. This wasn't about me. It wasn't even about Trina and Nolan. It was about the kids. The judge was an older man, quiet and observant, looking over the papers in front of him without any urgency. I felt like I was in a waiting room, just waiting for the inevitable. My lawyer had advised me to keep it simple. No dramatics, no big speeches, just the facts. Trina's lawyer spoke first, all sharp edges and professional calm. He painted me as a soldier, someone who had no business being a mother figure. He talked about my rigid approach to the kids, how I ran the house like a boot camp. "She's not a nurturer," he argued, turning to the judge with a look that made it clear he thought I didn't belong here. "She's a soldier, and soldiers don't know how to be mothers." I didn't flinch. I had expected it. I had expected every word of it. But I wasn't going to let him define me. I stood up when it was my turn, keeping my voice level. I didn't need to make a scene. "I didn't teach them to salute. I just gave them someone worth listening to," I said, and there was nothing dramatic about it. It was just the truth. I gave them stability. I gave them structure. That's all I've ever done. The room fell silent. Trina's lawyer didn't have an answer. The judge just scribbled something down on his notepad, but his gaze never left me. It was the kids' turn to testify, and my stomach twisted as they were led up to the witness stand. They were both stiff, their small bodies still, their faces unusually serious. I couldn't help but feel protective in that moment. This wasn't just a legal case for them. This was their life being picked apart. But they didn't hesitate. They didn't back down. Ethan went first. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it before, but his words were honest, simple. "She's not my mom," he said, eyes down, "but she acts like one." "A nice one?" I wanted to say something to reassure him, but I held my breath, letting him speak. It was hard hearing it. He wasn't calling me mom, but it didn't matter. It wasn't what I expected, but it was what he needed to say. Eli followed, his small voice filled with a truth I hadn't known he was capable of. "Captain says I'm not too much," he said, looking at the judge with wide, serious eyes. That's the first time I believed it. I felt my chest tighten. I hadn't realized how much he had internalized, how much that one simple phrase had meant to him. "You're not too much." The words I had used countless times when he was overrun by his own emotions. The words that told him he didn't have to shrink to be loved. That was the kind of stability they needed. Affirmation, security, someone who could handle the storm without letting it swallow them whole. The judge didn't speak for a long time after the boys were finished. He leaned back in his chair, scribbling in his notes. The air felt heavy. I couldn't tell where it was going, what he was thinking. But I wasn't backing down now. Finally, the judge cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the evidence. I find it compelling. While there are concerns regarding the children's emotional well-being, I am granting temporary guardianship to Ms. and last name, with supervised visitation for the parents, pending further review." I barely registered his words. My lawyer whispered something about the next steps, about the need for ongoing evaluations, but I couldn't focus on that. The judge had spoken, and for the moment, it was enough. Trina didn't say anything. She didn't even look at me. She just stood, her arms crossed, and walked out of the courtroom with her lawyer. Nolan followed silently behind her, looking anywhere but at me. But the boys? The boys were different. They were watching me, eyes wide like they had been holding their breath for this moment. They hadn't saluted me this time, but there was something in the way they looked at me, something that said they knew, deep down, that things were changing. When we left the courtroom, the air outside was heavy with the kind of quiet that followed a storm. The sun was just starting to dip behind the buildings, casting long shadows on the pavement. I bent down, eye level with Ethan and Eli, and smiled. "You're safe," I said softly, and for the first time in a long while, I meant it. Ethan nodded, his eyes searching mine, while Eli just threw his arms around me. "Captain," Eli said, his voice muffled against my shoulder. "Can we go home now?" I hugged him back tightly. We're already home. And for the first time, I believed it. The first night the boys moved in with me, it was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that filled you with dread, but the kind that made you believe things might be okay. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. I had set up the spare room for them. 2 twin beds, a few toys, the nightlight glowing softly on the dresser. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. They seemed unsure at first, like they were waiting for something to break, for some sign that things weren't permanent. But I wasn't giving them any room for doubt. We had a routine now, a rhythm that didn't need to be said out loud. They made their beds in the morning. They picked a spot to sit at the table. They shared one thing they were grateful for each day before dinner, and it was always something simple. Ethan once said he was grateful for cereal, and Eli for the way the sun looked when it hit the trees outside. It wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about grounding them in something that felt real, something stable. No more fighting, no more chaos, just rhythm. Dinner was a quiet affair, not silent, but peaceful. I'd made a rule that we all had to talk, share something from our day, and that made them open up in ways I hadn't expected. Ethan started talking about school again. He told me he had made a friend, someone who liked the same games he did. Eli? Eli talked about his drawings, stories he made up in his head that he'd never told anyone before. The things that came out of him were fragile, like he was testing the waters, afraid that if he spoke too much, it would slip through his fingers. They slept better, too. No nightmares. Not a single night of them tossing and turning or waking up in the middle of the night in a panic. They both stayed under the covers, their faces peaceful, breathing easy. That was my favorite part. The calm of their sleep, the stillness that told me I wasn't failing them. They still called me Captain Mommy sometimes, and I didn't correct them. The name fit for now. They needed someone to stand steady, and I needed to know they could depend on me to stay that way. But it wasn't perfect. I knew it wasn't. One night, just a week after they'd moved in, I got a text from Nolan. One line. Did you ever think I was enough? I stared at the screen for a long time, the words lingering in front of me. I could feel the weight of the history between us, the years of silence and distance that had never quite healed. But this wasn't about me and him. It was about the kids, about breaking the cycle. I didn't hesitate. I typed back, simple and clear. I see you now. That was it. I wasn't trying to rehash everything we'd been through. I wasn't trying to explain why I was doing this. I just wanted him to know that I saw him for the first time as someone who mattered, not as a brother or a failed father, but as a person who had been doing the best he could, even if it wasn't enough. I didn't get a reply. Instead, I moved forward. I made a quiet request for court-ordered family therapy. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't about replacing anyone. It was about making sure the kids didn't get lost in the cracks. They deserved that. They needed a chance to heal, to find their place in all of this. Trina might not have been ready for it, but Nolan, he could get there. I knew that. I wasn't trying to break anyone down. I just wanted to build something better for them. A home that wasn't just a roof over their heads, but a place where they could grow, where they could be safe. The next morning, as the sunlight crept through the curtains, I watched the boys from the kitchen as they sat at the table, giggling over some silly story they were making up. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. Not because I had all the answers, but because I was willing to keep moving forward, no matter what. And as I set the table, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we were building something real here. Something that could hold. The final hearing wasn't what I expected. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no fireworks or last-minute revelations. It was quiet. Almost too quiet. Trina didn't show. I couldn't say I was surprised, but something in me still twisted at the absence of her. Nolan sat alone at the table, his hands folded, his face unreadable. He didn't look at me, didn't even acknowledge that I was there. I could see the tiredness in his eyes, the weight of everything that had happened. But it wasn't about him today. It was about the twins. Always about them now. The judge, a different one this time, didn't waste time with niceties. He read through the file, glanced over the evidence, and then looked up at me. His expression was measured, professional. After reviewing all the facts, I find that the children's best interests lie with Miss last name. I am granting her permanent guardianship with supervised visitation for the parents. This decision is made with the understanding that this is a complex situation and that further review will follow. There was no applause, no relief flooding through me, just a quiet certainty that this was the right step, even if it was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. The judge didn't say more. He closed the file, dismissed us, and just like that, it was done. Outside, the sun was low, the world still moving, still noisy, like nothing had changed, but everything had. The boys were waiting by the steps, their hands shoved into their pockets, watching me. Their eyes flicked to each other, and then to me, like they weren't sure if they could ask the question yet. "Are you really our mommy now?" Ethan asked, his voice small but hopeful. I didn't answer right away. I just knelt down to their level, felt the cool breeze on my face, and let myself breathe for a second. "If you keep calling me that," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I'll keep showing up." Eli grinned, his face lighting up, as he took my hand and pulled me toward the car. "Captain Mommy," he said, a little louder this time, and Ethan followed suit with a quiet smile, repeating the title. That night, it was just another dinner. Spaghetti. A regular Thursday dinner, the kind I used to take for granted. But now it felt like something monumental, like we were finally settling into something real. There was no chaos, no interruptions, just the simple act of sitting down together, laughing over who could twirl the most noodles on their fork. Just us, the three of us. After dinner, we went outside. I handed the boys a small wooden sign I'd picked up that afternoon. It was plain, simple, with just a few words painted on it. Station 19, family lives here. Ethan and Eli looked at it like it was something sacred. They each saluted it, just like they did with me. Then they turned toward me, their faces serious, waiting. I opened my arms, and in that moment, I knew this was the start of something new. Something that wouldn't be perfect, but something that could stand. Something worth fighting for. "Permission granted, soldiers," I said, my voice steady. "Welcome home." They ran into my arms, laughing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight lift. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one falling away like the bricks of a wall I hadn't realized I'd been building around my heart. This was home now. No more pretending. No more chaos. Just us.